Welcome to the Higher Performing Managers episode of the Traits Podcast. I am interviewing Carmel Macpherson today. This was an interview that just brought me back in so many ways. Carmel is from Australia, and I actually have a really unique connection with Australia. My grandfather lived there for a while. My mother was born in Australia. And he told me a story, and I'm coming to a point here. He told me a story of how he would send love letters back and forth. When he was in Australia, my grandmother was in Alberta. They would send love letters back and forth, and it took a month for a letter to get to the other person. So they had this situation where she would send a letter, it would get to him, he would send a letter back, but they would send letters every 2 weeks. So they were always responding a little. There was always lag with all of the letters, always a 2-week lag. So they'd be responding to something and a month is going by, but 2 weeks between receiving things. Such a unique situation. And my point here is that I'm so grateful. We live in a world where I can talk with somebody really seamlessly from a complete opposite part of the earth and have a great conversation and learn so much. We can grow so much. Yes, the internet is wonderful. Yes, all these things are wonderful. It is so incredible that we can gain wisdom from podcasts, from people that have something that we can utilize in our own business, in our own lives in some ways. I am always floored by that. Excuse my joy in this aspect of the interview. As part of building higher performing organizations, it's important to cover various aspects. We have another episode coming up on leadership, but are covering something that is maybe the most overlooked in all organizations, and that is management. Carmel has some great insights and viewpoints that can round out a better understanding of how to build businesses that perform extremely well and get the best out of the people we hire or already have in our organizations. Again, excited about this episode. One other quick note before we start. Carmel talks a lot about traits in this episode. She talks about initiator profiles and implementer profiles, and she talks about the 7 different traits, and she talks about how people need to think or their different personality traits. I want you to, if you aren't really familiar with traits, go back and listen. We'll put this in the show notes, but go back and listen to the episodes that I've done with Mike, who is the owner of Concord Consulting, which has put together traits. He has so many good episodes, and we're building more on just understanding the basics that you can start to get to understand what people are meaning with this and start to build a framework which will help you moving forward. I'm taking too much time on this intro. I'm excited about this. Without further ado, I'll let you get into it. Welcome to this episode, Carmel Macpherson. You are somebody who has a really unique background. As we were getting to know each other a little bit ago, you talked about starting out as a teacher. You've talked about having time with the Aussie Police Force. You have talked about a lot of different aspects of your background, running HR, a lot of that kind of stuff. But really what stood out to me were 2 statements that you made when we talked a couple of weeks ago. One was that recruitment is broken, and the second one is that people often believe they are lacking in some way, and we as managers need to help them with that. So we're going to jump into that in a second. Before we do that, again, maybe bring a little bit more color than I did to your background. Where did you come from? Where does your expertise and experience come from?
Well, gee, that's a big question. I mean, I grew up in what's called the western suburbs of Sydney, and had a good education. And although I was the first person in my family to ever go to university, which is not that unusual in Australia for my generation, and I think teaching was the key thing that taught me what was really important in helping people grow. And I started in my first year teaching it was like blackboard jungle, an incredibly tough school. We lost, I think, 25 teachers in the first term. And I used to sit in my staff room listening to teachers scream and get louder and louder as the kids got louder and louder. This is in secondary school. And I realized that the only thing I was ever going to change, that had total control of, was me. So what could I stop doing, start doing, and do differently that would you know, enable a very pleasant staff room, classroom. So I gave myself a set of rules about making sure I was always well prepared for lessons, never raising my voice in the classroom. The key one was loving them. I decided I had to love them, knowing what sort of homes they came from. Um, and the stress levels in the classroom just went down like that. I was going to find something to be positive about with every single student in that classroom. And even now, some 60 odd years later, 55 years later, I can still see the facial expression on these children when young teenagers, when I would say, everybody, listen to how John's expressed this. John, this is terrific, sweetie. That's really well done. And and I thought, is this the only time in your life anybody's ever given you any positive feedback? So everything I needed to learn about performance management, I learned in that first year of teaching. And to be honest, the second key impact on me was Star Trek, the original series. Because when you think about how Kirk ran his team, you can find every one of the traits. And in fact, his recruitment was not broken, or Starfleet's wasn't broken. They knew if they needed a comms manager, they looked for a guru who had particular traits that would add to the team, not simply duplicate. And you saw this in Kirk's ready room when he sat around that table and there was just a free thing. Okay, here's our problem. Here's who's attacking us, whatever. Everyone's free to speak. And he would take that in and then ensure that as a manager, he was taking now an informed decision covering all the bases that the 7 traits cover. And he would then say, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, I will now take a decision and wear the accountability that a manager should be wearing. So that was my booster, if you like, in terms of how I wanted to behave myself, and what I demanded of myself, in every job that I had from there on in.
That is the first time so far in this podcast that we're introducing an idea of higher performance by talking about sci-fi shows. And yet it's funny, as I think back to that show, everyone has this really unique set of traits, don't they? And as long as they're in the right fit, as long as they're in the right role, that works extremely well. And it's fascinating. I can think about episodes where people were in the wrong role and things started breaking down quite quickly as well.
Very quickly.
So that is a fascinating introduction to this, as well as you were talking about children and going through grade school and talking about how people come from various backgrounds. We don't always know where people are coming from. That is absolutely the same as our employees, as our staff, as the team that we are working with. We don't know where people are coming from. Share how you have married these ideas or combined these ideas where you have taken care of people, encouraging them, seeing their strengths, their genius in different ways, and how you have developed that in order to manage really well.
Right. I would probably add a third one to it, and that is parenting, because anyone that has had the care of children knows that they're different. And if you apply a generic system to how you're going to raise them, you're going to run into trouble. And we all know, as parents, that we actually do need to treat them differently. Um, so how I applied that was that, when I was then in a role where I actually was a manager, let's say the first sort of big corporate role that I had, not that they were corporate, they were a research and development, Australia's largest research and development organisation called our CSIRO. We had 3,000 scientists, brilliant engineers, technical assistants, but we also had admin people, support people, and then also your normal corporate finance, blah, blah, blah. Um, so as the head of HR there, I was responsible for procurement of people. And I call it procurement. I thought of it as procurement because what I realized was even though human resources would have all these great ideas and try and get the role descriptions done, they had enormous trouble getting anybody to sit down and actually talk to them about what are the traits that would lead to success in this role. And even if that wasn't quite the language they were using back in those days, but that is what they were at. In other words, how do we make sure that we are actually only hopefully attracting but shortlisting people who are most likely to succeed in this role because they'll feel like it's basically their hobby. You know, funnily enough, for scientists that wasn't a problem. We almost innately knew what traits we needed for a scientist. But I then realized where we were running into trouble was that when I ran the demographics on who lasted after this extraordinary 1 year recruitment program for brilliant scientists, a number of them were leaving. Uh, and the research into that indicated that whilst they had all had to start as bench scientists in a team, in a research team, um, that those that were leaving were realizing that isn't actually where they were doing their best and wanted to be. Um, they wanted to take charge. um, and if I was running traits on those people now, these people had initiator profiles. These people were very comfortable with the risk, but you can't be too comfortable with risk as a bench scientist. You've in fact got to be meticulous. You've got to have that profile that really enjoys collaboration and talking. You won't have any trouble being assertive in your area of specialty, of course, but overall, you enjoy teamwork, and that's good. We want them to enjoy teamwork because we didn't want them having to chase promotion. And these projects, are going to take often 5, 10, 20 years. So the people leaving actually had the initiator profile, and the people very comfortable as bench scientists had implementer profiles. We actually have a completely different remuneration system in CSIRO that would to stop these people, bench scientists, having to move just to get more money. They could mount a business case that they had grown their intellectual capital, that they'd grown their capabilities. To this day, I don't know any other organisation that actually does this. So what that results in is people having to chase promotion to get more money, and they end up in the wrong job. And then they start saying, "What's happened to me?" I'm beginning to think, have I lost something? Have I had a mini stroke? I mean, I used to be so good and I got this promotion, but I know I'm not doing what I used to do as well as I used to do it. And as soon as you start to really explain that to them through traits, it was like my little student where this enlightenment would hit them and they'd say, "Oh my God, I'm in the wrong job." And I'd have to say, most people I ran this on, if there was scope in the organisation, we would actively help them try and get a better fit. If there wasn't scope, they invariably would leave. But they now knew what they were looking for, what type of role they actually were looking for. So it was just sort of using data to see who are we losing, who is coming to me for performance management action, but who actually was apparently the best in their field when they were appointed. So sometimes I used to say, well, I'm not sure who I should be sacking. Are you telling me that you've actually destroyed this person in the 12 months that you've had them? Because either there was something drastically wrong at the recruitment stage or there's been something very wrong at the management stage. And that's I think most people could relate to that story, where somebody started off really well, but then we promoted them into inefficiency and failure.
Right. I've heard both Dwayne and Mike often talk about how people are promoted to their least level of competence, which is something that you were talking about there. It's something that I've heard, and I haven't seen this from a lot of organizations, Carmel, but I've heard that certain organizations will have bands, which I think you were referring to, bands of pay within
Yeah.
different roles. And for example, if somebody is at the highest level of pay in maybe a junior role and moving into a management role or an entry level versus management role, they would actually take a pay cut to become a manager. And what
Yeah.
that does is erases that problem, like you've said, of chasing after more money by the promotion. Now people have to think, is this a fit, rather than, am I just making more money?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. So, um, it's. I mean, the job to me of any manager is the same really as a parent, and that is, um, I have, you know, procured somebody, and it's their brain at the end of the day, that we're after. Um, and my job is to make sure that that increases in value to the organisation. That person learns and is happy, and so on. Um, so if that's not happening, it's a yellow alert to me. What's gone wrong here? Another good example is actually a lot of talent programs, where we end up with a form of systemic discrimination, not in terms of gender, but in terms of traits. So what happened in one big organisation that where I managed HR was that the graduate program, the talent. I have all sorts of problems with talent programs, but this isn't the podcast for that. Um, and so the creme de la creme, so called, would be brought in and be given all sorts of special things, but they would have to spend 3 months over the year in totally different work areas of this organisation. Um, and there was one particular one that came to me and said, like they were used to sort of being regarded as good, but there were a couple of them where he didn't get a very, very good feedback and he was worried he was going to be thrown off the program. And it was interesting because I looked at his traits and I was arguing very strongly that every one of those people on the talent program should actually be put into equally challenging 3 month periods that were not aligned at all with their innate traits. And, so whereas it was the luck of the draw, you might end up in four of those quarters with ones that were a complete alignment. So, of course, you're going to do well. I mean, you've got the brain. We know that you've got the brain. And some other poor sucker ends up in two or three out of four that are the complete antithesis of their innate traits. Um, so there are all sorts of ways like that where I think it just comes back to where are your yellow alerts? What's really going on? What are the patterns in recruitment panels? Is there a common pattern that always leads to a poor result? In other words, have these people even been trained in interviews? We know interviews are the least successful formula for actually getting good people because most people on an interview panel don't know what they're doing, quite frankly. Um, Extroverts like me do fabulously. If you got that initiator profile and you're actually on the emotional control thing in the middle, you read their body language pretty quickly. You get them laughing pretty quickly. You're confident enough to say, "Gee, can we circle back to that question? I want to give that a little bit more thought." But if you're a completely different profile, um, you might be someone who's very shy. Someone who's doesn't have the confidence to do those sorts of things, and so you don't say anything. But the job might be perfect for that person. It might be a software coder. They don't want to mix with people. They want to just sit there, task focused and detail oriented. And where's the structure? What are the regulatory rules around this? Um, Whereas I'm one of those people that would say, well, it might be policy, but that was just, someone's bright idea at the time. It worked, but now let's change it. And the payroll people would go, oh, so it's just sort of getting to understand if we're going to spend all this money, what traits in a person are likely to grow the value of them intellectually and to make them pleasant work colleagues, to make them want to jump out of bed of a morning and to actually work to ensure that the money we're spending is money well spent, particularly as it was taxpayers' money in that particular organisation. Yeah. Sorry,
I,
you've got to stop me because I'll just ramble on.
No, this is fantastic. I am going to circle back to a couple things. I want to recover, or I want to cover recruitment in a minute here, or a little bit later in the interview. But first, I want to circle back to two things that you said. One was that you hold managers accountable. I think you said something along the lines of, so this person is struggling. So what did you do wrong? Not where are they doing wrong, but what are you doing wrong here? So maybe cover that. I might jump into the other point as well, but cover that first.
Yes. So we succeed, we hire somebody, and then we place them under the guardianship of a person who we are calling a manager and who we are paying to manage. And that means that we're paying them to take hard decisions, to be decisive, but in particularly to be caring of the very expensive asset we've just placed under their control and management. And I feel sorry for a lot of managers these days because we've never had more management courses and probably never had worse management, because so many managers are frightened to performance manage. And that term is a bit of a sort of a frightening term. Really, it's just like a teacher student in those first year or two, which is mentoring. And maybe mentoring would be a better term because that implies you actually are supposed to be doing something there's supposed to be an interaction occurring between you and me. And that interaction is with mentoring is that I am meant to ensure that you understand what's expected of you. You understand what I'm going to be looking for. You feel comfortable enough with me to come to me if you're not sure of that. And instead of me making you feel like a fool, I will ensure, and I'll start with going right back to my teaching thing. What could I be doing differently? Is there anything that I could stop doing, start doing, or do differently that would actually assist you with this, so that you wouldn't feel that you would or be embarrassed about the fact that you might feel like you've got to come back to me again and ask. So it's always easier to start with yourself. Um, because it almost then gives them permission to say, well, is there anything that you think you maybe could stop doing, start doing, or do differently? How could we both work on that? And that means you've got to be constantly communicating with people and available to them. I used to go and sit out on the floor amongst, my people. It's amazing what you'll overhear and and see who might be struggling a bit or whatever. I think a lot of managers think I'm a manager now and I'm just going to take notice now of everyone at my level, my peers and above, and make sure that I'm looking fabulous to the people above me and my peers. And they forget about the fact that, well, you can't have followership without leadership. If there's not a leader, then there's no follower. There are employees, but so I think you've got to be putting more effort into that managing down and mentoring down in order to elevate those people to start to lift them.
What's so fascinating about what you're talking about right now, Carmel, is that I mean, you talked about this with recruitment as well. It's easy to fake your way through an interview or ace an interview if you have a certain personality. If you're outgoing and engaging, you tend to do better in interviews, but that doesn't produce the best research scientists on your team.
No,
They're not
no,
going to be outgoing and gregarious in so
no.
many ways. And you talked about it in the same way, or at least this is the thought that I came up with as you're talking, was if we're managers and we are simply looking for the problem areas, if somebody can easily fly under the radar if they're not a squeaky wheel. Somebody can
Yes.
easily look like they're doing all right if we're not really engaging with people, if we're not really paying attention. They can again sneak by, or we can overlook certain things that we need to be paying attention to. Maybe speak to that a little bit. How can managers pay better attention to their staff, to the people around them, to their direct reports?
Well, the first thing I'd say is the obvious: talk to them. Make sure that you're making time for all of your particularly direct reports, um, and as I say, give permission for them to be honest. If they actually feel that you have their best interests at heart, rather than, oh my God, I'm not going to admit to anything, otherwise I'm going to be in trouble. They have to really, and so you've got to do a bit of work at the start in terms of, I care about you. Not just because, not just because of the results, but I want to make sure that the person that we send home every night actually is in good shape mentally and emotionally and physically. Um, I don't reward people who are sitting back till 9 o'clock at night. That just really is I'm thinking they're inefficient or they're trying to escape something at home. But either way, that's not good. That's a symptom. So I suppose you've got to be aware of these little yellow alerts, or I call them before they turn red. You've got to stop them turning red, and say who's putting in a lot of extra hours, who's taking maybe sick leave intermittently, who, So I mean, they're and as I say, give permission for them to be honest with you. Are you happy in this role? What could I do differently, or you're a particular manager? What in your mind, would enable you to actually feel that you could really do your best? Because I have a strong view that the role of a manager is to create an environment in which people can do their best and grow. So that's a question that I would ask. Are you in an environment that actually assists you to grow in this role? Is this an area that you would like to stay in and further develop in? Now, if the answer is, oh God, no, well, why? Why? Um, and managers can be very good, as I say, at managing up. So they get a fabulous performance report from their manager. But when you do a 360, it's not so rosy, So there's that, there has to be alignment. There has to be an alignment, a line of sight that actually is, I would, what I'm expecting to see from this person's direct reports. You know, what what have been your outcomes from this last week? What have you got lined up next week? And a traffic light. So I could just see straight away if one of those was red. And then my question was, is there anything that I can be doing to assist you? And what I meant by that was, is there someone you need to speak to that you need me to actually influence to make that happen? Or would you like to have a brainstorm with some of your colleagues and me, because you might be stuck somewhere? So it was sort of giving permission to be stuck and to they had to pass this around, so everybody saw it. And I said to them, never come to me and tell me that you have no idea what X is doing, because that just tells me you haven't been reading, because they've been telling you every week. But it also meant that people were never going to get into trouble for doing it if we'd all said that's fine, go ahead with it. I used to, like you, I used to say, never worry about coming to me with something you've completely buggered up. Number one, it's always going to come out in the wash anyway. But firstly, I'm your manager and I'm accountable. I'm the interface between you and whatever flack there is, because I get paid more money than you. That's part of my job, is to take that flack. And what I'm going to do is work through with you what went wrong, because if we don't understand that, then it's going to be repeated. I said, I only going to get interested if I keep seeing the same thing being repeated, the same mistake being repeated, because that's telling me you or we aren't learning. And part of my job is to grow your intellectual capital. So if we're not learning all the time, a lot of a job is problem solving and working out what not to do. So, I mean, that's all efficiency is at the end of the day, is, we could take that step out. That step causes more problems than it solves, or the cost benefit's not there with that and that. I love problems, that sort of problem solving, and I used to like doing it with the person that was having a problem, because who wants to do a bad job? I just don't believe that anyone comes to work fired up at the thought that they're going to bugger something up. They don't want to do that. They want to feel proud of what they've done. They want to leave thinking, I might have only done one thing, but geez, I did it bloody well. They want to be able to say to their family, I got a really great, feedback from my boss today, or from my colleagues today. Um, but I think a lot of managers start off with expecting everything to be going wrong and micromanaging to make sure it doesn't. And by doing that, they make sure it does.
Rather than
It's
having the
really small.
expectations that people are going to rise to the occasion, that they're going to be honest, that they're going to work hard, that they're going to try their best. Having very
Yes.
different expectations leads to different outcomes. So I want to dig down into this management thing again,
Mm.
because you keep coming back when I ask you managerial questions. You keep coming back to managers taking responsibility for things here. How can we as organizations help managers take on more responsibility for what's going on around them?
Introduce them to traits. And I know that sounds like that's sort of a ridiculous plug for traits, but as a manager who had used every psych thing that you could think of, when I was first asked about, using traits, I had just actually retired from my last organisation and went back to HR consultancy with my own company. And I remember saying actually to Mike at the time, I said, well, I haven't just spent 40 years building up a, reputation and so on, just to hand that over to whoever asks me to start to use their product. I said, I'll tell you what I'll do though. I'll road test your product. I'll road test it for 6 months and see what I think of it, and then I'll get back to you. All I can say is, really, within 2 to 3 months, I thought, oh my God, I wish I'd had this. I wish I'd had this. I mean, there are things that come close to it, certainly, other programs, but I have never come across any that do what Traits does, because it's the only one I've really come across. And I know Teams tries to do this as well, but no one does it as well as Traits does, where they realize we need to understand the traits of a role. If we start there, and if we're right, and you can only be right if you need to look at, well, what people have been successful in this role. Let's get them in as well in terms of what we think, we should be really looking for in recruitment for a person. This is difficult if it's a very small company, by the way. I mean, this is going to be a lot easier in big organizations because you can make a mistake, and if you still know what you're doing with the traits, you can, organize for some move sideways, or whatever, whatever. But that fundamental understanding is normally missing with managers because they don't put the time and attention into thinking about what traits are required in a role for it to be successful. Um, and therefore, and it might only be a 1 year role, it might be a pretty savage change management role, for example. Um, if that's the case, put someone in for a term, put them in for 12 months, they can come in and they can handle that. But so it actually leads to all sorts of other decisions about, well, what tenure does someone really need in this role? And if we're looking for those particular traits. And that then allows you to simplify really markedly your recruitment process, because you now really know what you're looking for. And you can then test referees, on does this person exhibit that particular attention to detail that we must have in this role? Or this is a role that really, take a graphic designer and so on, this will demand creativity. This is in the science organization, this was almost the most important, because for a research scientist, they had to have a PhD, which means they had to have made an original contribution to knowledge. Um, so, we obviously don't want someone who managed to sneak through and actually doesn't even regard themselves as having any creativity. And that's the other. Creativity is an interesting one because creative people just have to talk out their ideas. They just can't help it. I'm creative, and I'll always sit there thinking, have you thought about, whatever, whatever. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're assertive or have an initiator profile, because a lot of implementers do need to be highly creative. But what I find is a supervisor will then say, gee, Carmel's got a lot of it. Yeah, she's got get up and go. She's always offering ideas in meetings and things. Let's make her the team leader. And I might go, I have the slightest interest in managing anybody. I love being working in a team. So it's just that enlightenment, if you like, empowerment of truly understanding what a role requires and how I might be able to marry that up with people. And if I can't, what's the most important thing there though? That I really do would like an innate trait, rather than someone having to behave out of preference all the time. And if I end up with someone who's behaving out of preference over the whole seven traits, I've got a very stressed and tired person, emotionally, and probably even intellectually. Um, so if I think if managers, if we could help managers understand what their role actually is in mentoring their people, and understanding what a legitimate requirement of this person now is, because they understand what's required in the role. I've been very clear, if you like, with my KPIs for that person, and not just impose them on them, but speak to them about which one of these you're likely to find a bit challenging. Which one do you think you might like me to, be a bit more available to you on, and so on. That their jobs would be just a lot easier,
Yeah, that's
you
such an
know.
interesting way of viewing this. I don't think I mean, we hear this internally all the time. We talk about it internally in Concord, but I rarely heard somebody on the outside say, in order to really help managers, we need to help them understand the roles, their own role, and the roles that their direct reports are going to be fitting into or not fitting into very well. Because
Yes,
then we're placing unfair expectations on everyone. There's going to be a lot more stress. Everyone's job becomes more difficult. It's funny because as you talk about roles, often we are helping people with job descriptions. Job descriptions are just trash so much of the time. Like every job description says they need to be a strong communicator, and that's not correct. There are
no,
many positions where people don't need to be a strong communicator. They don't need to be open or gregarious or social. They don't need to be that. In fact, if they were, they'd be awful at their roles. So again, starting with
exactly.
job descriptions, really understanding these roles, and then because of that, understanding who the people are around us and being able to, I'm going to drill back into something you said previously. Does that not make it easier to see where these yellow flags are popping up if we know
Yeah.
our staff better?
Oh, absolutely. And also, as I said, I'm very data driven as well. So, what sort of patterns would I start to see? That would indicate, a yellow flag. And to be perfectly honest, I actually think it'd be much easier if people go into ChatGPT or Perplexity and say, give me the personality requirements for such and such. Because at least it's better than basically pulling something with moths on it out of a drawer, or people um, just taking a best guess and throwing in all these ridiculous generic traits that are not required in the role at all. At least it gives you something to start with that is likely to be somewhat more accurate than, the ignorant musings of people, giving it 5 or 10 minutes. Um, the first thing they should do is think about who succeeded in this role, who's done really well, what characterizes that person. I think we've just, I was going to say, we've made recruitment so hard in many ways. Whereas again, if you think of it as a procurement, which it is, we're just hiring an organic asset rather than a mechanical asset, or software or something. But procurement always have rules and regulations, and they really think through about, well, what is the blueprint, for that we would need, for this, and they put a lot of work and effort into their procurement. I've always thought, well, at the very least, I'd like to have a procurement person on the HR panel to bring the same rigor to it as is brought to it. And who amongst us, I love always using analogies as well. Who amongst us decides that we want an extension to our home and says to the builder, go for it? We'll see how it turns out. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, what we're doing with our organic assets is we're putting a blindfold on and we don't even have a blueprint. And then I call it pious hope management. We hope it's all going to turn out okay. Um, Whereas you need never have given yourself that worry if you'd actually done a little bit of homework in the first place about what traits in a person and in a role are required for me to look good. I mean, it's not even asking them to do something that makes them look bad. This is all about how can I look like I'm a bloody fabulous manager? Well, I can be one.
Yeah, that hope and pray strategy is used a little bit too much, which never ends on budget with time or money, right? In the end, that's a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for inefficiencies all over the place. Now, you have talked or maybe hinted at mentorship a number of times as we've spoken
Mm.
here. What do you believe goes into phenomenal mentoring? What are the key aspects? What do we need to be looking for? How do we prepare people for stronger mentorship?
Um, well, I suppose speaking on both sides of it here, one is that for anybody, that people have to be willing to be mentored. So they need to understand that part of my job is mentoring you. I will be assessed on that. And part of my performance management of you is your openness to feedback from me, which I hope will always be constructive, open to coming to me when you need assistance with something. Think of me as I'm here as your helper. You know, I'm not here just to find, as you said with parenting, not here to just find fault with you. I'm being equally judged on how successful you are in the role. So I'm very open to working with you and assisting you. That doesn't mean I can give you 10 hours a week. So we have to make sure that time is used very productively. And so I might use a couple of tools there, like that sheet I spoke about, where you can start to tell me on a scale maybe of 1 to 5 what you're finding challenging in particular, and it might be making friends. you know, um, there might be a particular colleague that you need to work with who's not being open to you. So basically, giving them permission for a private thing to me to give me time to think about it, of where you believe you're having some problems, where you'd like to have stronger skills in something, what you think might be of assistance to you to give you particular skills. It might be particular training that you've realised you're not as good at with Excel as you thought you were. It might be something simple. I call that quantitative gaps. So, and I look at quantitative gaps and qualitative gaps. Quantitative gaps we can normally fix pretty quickly, if people have been honest about it, but we'll see the results of it if their details always, wrong and they're just not taking notice of things. But well, it does tell me something about their detail trait. But so I give them permission to be honest with me about where can I be the most help, because my time's precious too. I don't want to be, I know I might in fact put you onto somebody else who can help sort that out. If it's a qualitative gap, it's much more difficult. If I had people coming to me saying, Sue is just impossible to work with. She's always moody. She's, whatever. So we're not getting out of her what we want because we don't even like going and talking to her. Okay, we've got a qualitative problem here. And either Sue doesn't understand how she's coming across to people. You can't just assume she's just being narky. It may well be that her role and her job and her personality is someone who goes really deep into the detail, and she might generally just not even hear them to start with. So we just got to think, well, what is leading to this behaviour in Sue? Um, and that means number one, being honest with Sue. So some of your colleagues are finding you a bit difficult to interact with. Let's talk about that. Why that might be. Is it that you don't like interacting with people? And she might say, well, no, Carmel, I don't like interacting with them. And then my answer is, well, then you probably applied for the wrong job because you're going to have to interact with people. So are you willing to act out of preference in those times? Because those people have a right to actually be getting particular data from you or getting something from you. and you're making their job a lot harder. Are you, so I mean, so that sort of discussion is what I'm getting at.
And
So am I dealing with a qualitative one, or just someone like someone coming in late every day? You know, um, most managers just leave it in the pious hope that it will just fix itself. Um, you know, again, it's just like kids. Basically, every situation is a learning situation. Okay, what have I just taught that person if I've said nothing about them being late for 3 weeks? I have taught them that there's nothing wrong with being late. And then I have the hide to jump on them about being late 3 weeks later. And they're like, huh? I mean, well, I thought it was fine. I mean, no one ever said anything. It's a lack of courage. Managers have to understand that if you take on a management role and of guardianship and mentorship of the company's organic assets, you have to exercise courage. And not enough managers exercise courage of, I'm going to hate this, but I know I have to do it. Difficult conversations, we call them, but it doesn't matter that they're difficult. They become difficult because you didn't do your job from day one.
right.
Um, it's I say treat people in the way you like to be treated. If I'm doing something that is not helpful, tell me. But you get this in relationships where people go on and on in their relationship, and then 20 years later she stabs him through the heart with a knife. I mean, because he left the tube off the toothpaste or so. I mean, those things build up and build up, and we don't want to say anything. Oh, I might hurt their feelings. Well, for heaven's sake, grow up. I mean, or I remember someone once came to me and said they didn't like doing all of that. I said, well, that's fine. I said, I'm cutting your pay by 25%. And they say, oh, yeah, what? I said, well, you've just told me that you don't want to do 25% of your job. Why would you expect 100% of what we're, I mean, it's true, isn't it? What I'm saying is true.
Yeah,
You want all the perks and stuff. You want the big salary, but you don't even want to have a conversation with Tom.
so much of this is coming back to finding the right person for the right role. I think about that person who has more assertiveness, more than their sociability, and so they can have those difficult conversations, and they're not difficult for them. They might feel difficult at times, but when we catch things when they're small, they're not big yet. And something that comes to mind as you're talking about this, Carmel, is so much of the time we are thinking that what we all want, because we've been talking about parents and children, we want that mom or dad that's just our good friend and kind to us. And that's actually not what people want. What people want, there was this really unique study done with the two great psychologists of the time. This is probably in the 60s. And they, excuse me, they took two different psychologists and they took one individual. She was probably, I think she was in her early 30s. And they gave her a session or a number of sessions with both psychologists. And one psychologist, he was known for just being this kind, fatherly figure. And this is while I was doing my master's degree in psychology. The other one was somebody who was very direct. He wasn't rude, he wasn't mean, but he was very direct. And he would call attention to what was ever coming up in the moment and held the person who was in the room with him as responsible for their own choices and reactions. And it was fascinating. I went into that thinking, oh, Carl Rogers, the guy who's kind and the dad-like figure, he's going to be the one that this woman just loves and that she really grew from. And it was exactly the opposite. When it came at the end, she was interviewed and said, give us your experience with both therapists. And she said, Carl Rogers was kind. He felt like a dad. I felt loved. I felt cared for. And it was a really fun experience. It was a comfortable experience. But I didn't grow at all from it. And they said, who would you go to again? And she said, I'm going to pick the other guy because the other guy held me accountable and grew me. And I think that that's what we need from our managers is being big enough, being willing enough to give constructive, good, helpful feedback. Going back to one of those first things that you mentioned, Carmel, was we also have to show that we care about people. But
Yes.
if we're showing we care about people, then we can give that feedback and hold people's feet to the fire. And they, at the end of 6 months, a year, 18 months, 30 years, whatever it is that they're
Mm.
in our care for, they are going to be better for it and be more excited because they've grown, not because it was comfortable.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, these poor people end up as managers who have a profile of liking collaboration. They like, just concentrating on tasks. They like structure. They like going down into detail. They're not very adaptable. And we wonder why. So, for example, if you're not somebody who's comfortable with taking decisions and comfortable with a bit of risk, that person is going to set up working parties to abrogate risk. Everything's going to slow down. They just, it's not in them innately to just say, right, this is what we're doing. Think of Kirk here. Um, so, but they don't know that. Now, if they know that that's their trait and they just, for whatever reason, have to take on a management role, if they know that that's how they have to behave, then they can say, I am going to have to behave out of preference here. I'm going to, I'll take as informed decision as I can because I know that gives me more comfort. But I'll recognise there's a timeline here. I can't hold this up with 16 working parties for 2 months. I have to be, and those people actually have to be more courageous than people like you and me because we don't actually have to be courageous to have those discussions. They come easily to us. Those people are the true heroes because they actually have to be courageous. And what they will find is that it will become easier. The world didn't collapse, whatever, because they took a decision.
This is so brilliant, Carmel. And I'm looking at the time. I want to jump into a couple other areas, but you know what? For today, what I'm going to say is let's communicate over the next few months and do this again because I want to get the full Carmel experience on these other topics rather than just messing around with them for a few minutes. If that's okay with you,
Sure.
does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I've really enjoyed it. Yeah,
Brilliant. Okay,
thank you.
so before we go, what are you doing right now? If somebody needed to reach out to you, or if you could offer your services to somebody, or just kind of go through if it was useful for you, if it helped you in some way to give out contact information, what would that contact information be? How would somebody find you?
Well, they would write to me at carmel@rollaffinity.com. I've realised that no one knows the word affinity anymore, but still, I did it as a because affinity between a person and a role. But so ROLEAFFINITY.com, Carmel@rollaffinity.com, and go into my LinkedIn profile. My contact information is there, and yeah, so I mean, I suppose, I mean, and don't get me wrong, God, I mean, you learn by your own mistakes as well. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm the world's best manager, but that's it. You've got to be open. You've got to be open to learning and have the courage to accept where you could do better yourself.
Agreed. And what again? We will put these links in the show notes so that people can reach out to you or make it a little bit easier for them. Before we do that though, and before we finish up, just share if you were offering your services, where would somebody get the most value? Where would their problem areas be in order to get the most value from your services?
I think managing. One of the things I really enjoy is coaching, um, but I don't have a generic program for it. I go I look at what's your role, what's expected of you, and we work on that, and we work on what that person could stop doing, start doing, or do differently in that role. And the very first thing I do always is traits. We profile the role and we profile the person because that leads to empowerment on their part to actually understand why they've been having trouble, in different places. Yeah. And that leads then through into really almost a business coaching, but how can you do much better at what you're being paid to do, and feel better about it yourself. Yeah.
That's perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time with us. Thank you for
That's
being
a
willing
pleasure.
to invest in this podcast and investing in others, because this is going to help a lot of people as people do listen to it. So I appreciate it, Carmel. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
It takes decades for most of us to understand where we fit in this world. And something that came out of this interview with Carmel was that a good manager can help. A good manager can help understand where we fit, can find a better fit for us in a company where we're working, or maybe tell us that we're not a good fit here, and that our best fit is somewhere else, which I really appreciate. I want to shout out to anyone who is using traits, because Carmel talked about it a lot. Again, I'll send a couple of links here at the bottom in the show notes. But if you have a license, if you're using traits and you have a license, I want to make sure that you know that we have this new comparison tool that you can look, and this is right in alignment with this week's episode. You can take a job role, a job model, and you can take a person and you can see where they are differing, where it is a perfect fit and where it's not a perfect fit. And then this tool that we've created in traits in the app, you can now look at what specifically does this mean. If somebody's not a fit in this way, if there is a little bit of a gap here, what does that mean? What are you going to see? How are you going to see this show up in this person carrying out their role, which I think is so incredibly valuable. We've had tons of great feedback from people who are using traits and are really enjoying this new tool. One quick thought. I sometimes wonder about this. Somebody's listening to this and thinking, people are talking about employees like kids. That's so demeaning. And I want to just take a step back from that and say, I don't think it is demeaning. New recruits, like children, simply need time and space to learn what they don't know yet. I think about myself as a child. Every time I've lived in 4 different countries, every time I live in a new country, it's like I'm like a kid again. I need to relearn these things. So I think it's actually valuable to think about, how do we manage people? How do we help them? How do we grow them in their roles? Here are a few things that were mentioned that I'm not going to go into right here. I'm going to focus in on what I believe are the essential tips that Carmel had for us here this week. She talked about quantitative gaps versus qualitative gaps, important, growing intellectual capital. I think the quote that she gave was, the role of a manager is to create an environment in which people can do their best and grow. And I love this quote. So here are some of the essential tips that I believe came out of this episode. The key to management, when I asked, Carmel said, is to better understand 2 things. We need to understand the person and we need to understand the role. The role is often overlooked. And it surprised me when Carmel said this, but it makes sense. Really, she said people need traits, right? And what she was meaning there as we got into it was, really, we need to understand this job model, this role that we're placing somebody in. Because if we put somebody in a place where they don't fit, it's going to be very difficult for everyone involved. The real question here, I believe, is, do my direct reports fit their roles? What can I expect from my direct reports? How can I support my direct reports in becoming a greater version of themselves? How can I help them reach their genius in an area of this business? Something that they have the natural ability in. How do we grow that? How do we allow them to completely flourish in this? What would it look like to give people shorter contracts? This is something that I found fascinating, and this is more my idea, but it's based in what Carmel was saying. What would it look like if we gave people shorter contracts when we weren't sure about the position change in the company? So somebody's moving from one position to another, and we said, hey, let's trial it for a short period of time. Instead of just giving it to somebody, why don't we trial it and see how it works? And instead of giving somebody like this new office and the new placard and the new everything, and then really it being so destructive when somebody struggles in it, if we're not sure, if we're sure about something, that's a different situation. If we're not sure about somebody, what if we just took kind of a trial at it, where no one's going to be offended, no one's going to be embarrassed at the end? It allows somebody to try something out, trial it out, and if they're not a fit, great, we know, and we can change it back to where they are a good fit. Is this something that hurts a company because it isn't full steam ahead? Maybe. Or would it actually help the company and people because it could pull back without too many hurt feelings in the end? I don't know the answer to this. It was a thought that came up to me as I was listening to Carmel. One thing that she said was that it's important to see the yellow flags. And she didn't talk about red flags all that often. She talked about yellow flags. And I thought this was fascinating because red flags, we focus on them. So much of the time, yellow flags kind of fly under the radar because we are assuming that somebody will do everything that is expected. And she used the example of a contractor, and this is a really good example where we hire somebody and go, we expect them just to be on budget and on time and do everything. They're really good at their job. And because we're not managing the contractor, because we are not keeping the contractor accountable in certain ways, things can often fall apart very, very, very quickly. And I'm not talking poorly about general contractors here, but I believe a lot of us have had situations where we've been really disappointed. And I believe that if we went in and looked for the yellow flags right away, we could probably pay attention to them if we were willing to manage general contractor, direct reports, whoever it is. And rather than assuming, we open ourselves up to understand what we can get out of a person and what we need to help them with. I think everything would run on just a little bit better in life in general, let alone business or organizations. Another aspect that Carmel touched on was managers needing to understand that part of their job is mentorship. She said a great mentor asks, basically, is there something else going on here? How do we help Sue become even better at what she already has a great propensity for? How do we create more learning situations? How do we grow people long term? How do we use many situations as growth opportunities? A mentor is invaluable. Again, personal anecdote. I am in business. I am also in real estate. And I bought a property from somebody who is just, the more I get to know him, I just go, this guy is such a brilliant human being. As I got to know him, I realized, wow, this guy really knows real estate. And then I got to know him more and I went, oh, this guy has so much wisdom to give me in business. And I got to know him more and he's given me advice and help with personal life, with kids, with family, with so many areas of life, physical health, mental health, with an ability to grow my wealth in a different way. And I go, a good mentor can do that. A good mentor can offer so much to another individual. And I believe there's a kernel, a nugget, a golden nugget that we need to value and say, okay, how do I grow mentors in my organization? How do I become a better mentor in my organization? In the end, I think managers need to have a lot of courage. And that is something that Carmel said, to have difficult conversations. Having said that, if we find the right managers, and we talked about this, the right manager will have an easier time having those conversations because for them, it doesn't take a lot of courage. For them, it's just part of their job and it's something that they are good at. And that as they grow the skill that it is already in them, as we allow them to flourish, managers to flourish in that role, they can now have those difficult conversations and encourage and keep accountable and grow and help and mentor in so many ways. I think the most exciting part of this conversation with Carmel for me was the fact that it's about managers. Because again, my personal belief is that managers are often overlooked. The roles of managers are overlooked. The value of managers is often overlooked. Unless we're really struggling in an organization, then we start to go, oh, wait a second, these positions are so incredibly important. And when I talk to people who have a lot of business experience and wisdom, often what I hear them talk about is management. I'm going to leave some links at the bottom here. Please jump into this. I'll leave some links of Mike's past episodes about traits. I'm going to leave a link for Carmel's email address and her LinkedIn profile. Explore that. Explore what management looks like for you and how to get better managers or to make sure that you're growing yourself as a manager. Enjoy the rest of your week.